Good evening, everyone, and welcome to The Liberty Show. You are on The Liberty Show with Kevin Fortune, a national platform where you, the citizen, can raise your voice for all things liberty. Tonight, we have a really interesting show. We have a special show. It's a debate between our policy director and one of our new guests, the Libertarian versus the anarcho-communist, whatever that is. But we're going to find that out tonight. Who's right or wrong? We're going to see who fits into America. Not really right or wrong, but different people's perspective. So let's get started. We're going to have our two panelist debaters introduce themselves. We're going to start with our special guest, Mr. Jedidiah. Jed, welcome to The Liberty Show. Give us your introduction.
My name is Jedidiah, and I am an anarcho-communist.
Can you give us a quick overview? What's like 2 or 3 of the basic points for an anarcho-communist?
Well, most of it has to do with who owns the means of production. Now, communism, a lot of people will take the term communism and automatically associate it with, a super authoritarian centralized government, which it doesn't necessarily need to be, because communism and socialism mainly have to do with the worker and their relation to the means of production. I mean, full-out communism is technically supposed to be worker-owned means of production, and the way that's been dealt with in the past is they'll have a centralized government, whereas anarcho-communists don't believe in having a centralized government. They believe in worker-owned means of production, but they believe in individual worker councils working together and deciding how resources should be distributed based on from each according to their ability, to each according to their needs. So
that sounds straight out of Atlas Shrugged.
Yeah, well, that is a Marxist term, and Ayn Rand definitely did use it, but like yeah, I don't even want to get into.
Well, we're going to get back to you. Let's get Mr. Tim Smith, the Public Policy Director for The Liberty Show. Tim, introduce yourself.
Well, I am Tim Smith. I am a libertarian, in case our listeners haven't caught on to this fact. I believe that liberty for the individual is the greatest thing that an individual will ever experience. And unfortunately, we live in a country that does its best to stifle the liberty for the individual through the duopoly. Both the Republicans and the Democrats are either side of the same coin that was dropped into a hot, boiling piece of turd. But yet our overlords try to convince us that there is a difference between tyranny under the Republicans versus tyranny under the Democrats.
Okay, well, guys, my first question, which is a biggie, but I want it in a very simplistic, generic form, and then we're going to break this kind of question down, and then if our viewers have any questions, we'll let them pick it. So first to Jed, and then to Tim. First question I have is a biggie, but we're going to narrow it down to your basic concept. What is the role of government? First to you, Tim, the libertarian, and then to you, Jed, as an anarcho-communist. What is the role mainly of the federal government? Let me say that.
Well, thank you for the awesome question. When that question, and it's a common question, comes up, I always think about our illustrious President Obama. I wasn't the biggest fan of his presidency, but one thing he did get right was he stated that the Constitution does not tell the government what it can do. The Constitution tells the government what it cannot do. The role of the government, the first role of the government, is not to shoot you in the face. The second role of the government is not to take yourself. So anything outside of that is up to the individual to decide what government is for them. Our caller of our show, Quentin, he said when he heard what the good news of libertarianism is, he said that it seems like it's everything to everybody and that he could get behind that. And that's the great thing about libertarianism. We don't care what it is that you do. We don't care whether you are for socialism. We don't care whether you're for communism. The only thing that we ask is that you don't use force to convince us that your way is the right way when it comes to government.
That was a really good answer. Tim, that's why you get the big bucks. Okay, Mr. Jedidiah, will you answer the question? What is the role of the federal government to anarcho-communists?
Well, to an anarcho-communist, I mean, in an ideal anarcho-communist society, there wouldn't be a federal government.
Okay, good answer. Okay. So as we talk about, I want to kind of break that down a little bit into more specifics, and then we're going to get some questions from our panelists. I'm sure they're going to, or let you guys go to your questions. So what is the role of the government in educating people or educating its citizens, whether they're paid for or not paid for? What do you say, Jed? What is the role of the federal government in educating people?
Well, are we talking what the current role of the federal government should be, or what it would be in a completely ideal situation?
You can do both. You can do both, however you want to answer it.
In a completely ideal situation, education would be handled by, the parents, and the child would be, brought into general education to learn the basics, and people would analyze how they're doing and say, well, this person has strengths in this person has strengths in that. We can, this person enjoys this, and they would be, ushered in the right direction through whatever school or apprenticeship or that type of thing the student would be good in and would enjoy. That would be the ideal role. Currently, though, since we don't really have that, the role of the federal government should be to take the tax dollars everybody pays and provide everybody with a decent basic education that would teach them how to get along in life and teach them the realities of the world. Not so much like basic history, that type of stuff, the stuff that it's important to learn so that it doesn't get repeated. But
I ain't even going to touch that one. Okay, let's go to Tim real quick, and then we'll come back with some rebuttals. Tim, what is the role of the federal government in educating its citizens?
That's an awesome question. If I can, for just one moment, I want to correct my friend Jedidiah. We do not pay taxes. What happens is that we are extorted for our tax money. Now, getting to the question of what is the role of federal government when it comes to education. The role that the federal government should play in educating should be left up to the individual. For instance, I don't have any kids. I didn't have any fun, therefore I didn't create any kids. Since I didn't have any fun and I didn't create any kids, I shouldn't be extorted for paying for your kids. You had all the fun, you should pay for them. Now, let's say that under the libertarian thought, I want to help you pay for your kids even though you had all the fun. Well, that shouldn't be forced on me to do. That should be something that I voluntarily do because I'm just such a great person. But again, we do not pay taxes. They are extorted from us. So as a libertarian, and specifically as an anarcho-capitalist, I take great issue with paying for other people's kids to be educated against my will.
Do you have a rebuttal to that, Jed?
That's, the level at which children are educated does kind of have an effect on our day-to-day interactions in society. I mean, like, I know that you want to think that it's not your problem, other people's kids, you didn't have them, but eventually these kids are going to be your employees. So, if you're a business owner, or the people that you're dealing with when you go to the store, or the people that are stocking the shelves or driving the trucks. I mean, if we have to live in a country with a defined border, okay, and that's a whole different issue with me. That's a whole different can of worms. But if we have to live in the United States of America, the part of our cover charge, which is basically, to be in the club, which is basically the taxes that we end up having to pay, I don't think it's necessarily a bad idea to make it so that these people that we deal with on a day-to-day basis aren't, at least know how to add. I mean, what the hell?
I agree with you, Jed. everyone on the podcast know that's my biggest pet peeve, but they aren't getting educated. That's a whole nother show. They can't read and write, they can't add.
That's a whole nother fucking ball game. There's a certain side of the political aisle, and don't get me wrong, I'm not going to sit here and defend either side. So what I'm about to say isn't necessarily letting one side off the hook, but it's necessarily calling out another side. There's been one side of the political aisle that has been steadily defunding education, and both sides of the political aisle have been sending all kinds of money that could be used for education and spending it on a 20-year war. I mean, when you underfund education, and as a disabled person who went through the public school system, I can tell you about the joys of having a conservative governor who underfunded the heck out of basic education and the results of that. But I
halfway agree with you, but just throwing more money at the top, we've got lots of experience that doesn't always work. Okay, let's go on. We've got Patrick down in South Florida.
If I could respond to that, and very quickly, Jedidiah, your words have touched me. So now I'm beginning to see your point of view. So now I'm beginning to question, should I be that selfish when it comes to educating my neighbor's kids? You see, that's how things work in a libertarian society. I say I don't want to pay for it. You give me really good reasons on why I should pay for it, and then I begin to question my stance on why I shouldn't pay for it. Unfortunately, where we are in this country today is someone says, this is what you're going to pay for. I say, I don't want to pay for it. And then men and women with guns show up to my house and they collect me so that I can pay for it. And if I put up a fight, then they shoot me in the face. And this is the problem that I have, is the force that government requires when it comes to good ideas. We have a saying in the libertarian movement and the liberty movement and as a whole, good ideas don't require force. This is the problem that we face in today's society, is that you may have a good idea and it may be a great idea, but you should sit down and convince me that you have a great idea instead of sicking the dogs of the government to collect me and shoot me in the face should I not agree with your good idea.
Well, yeah, ideally, that would be the way that it works, but it doesn't work that way. I mean, obviously, there is a government and they are extorting taxes from you. And there's a huge portion of the society that either doesn't care enough to vote about it or, sides with one of the two parties. Some of the reasons why the Libertarian Party has had more trouble than it should, honestly, because there's a lot of points when it comes to American libertarians that I can agree with and I can get behind, but it seems like the libertarian answer to an authoritarian government is just another hierarchy. And that's the hierarchy of the people who have a whole bunch of money and can afford to hire people to exert the force that the government once did to get what they want, and the people who don't. And that's no better than what we have now. As a matter of fact, in some ways, depending on where you live and who's the local warlord, it could be worse. So, I mean,
I kind of agree with you, and then we're going to move on, but I just want to make a good comment that, there is a hierarchy of social injustice in our country, but, whose fault is it? Is it our responsibility to lift everyone out of poverty? Just because we educate them or give them some money doesn't mean they're going to lift up, and that is the only thing that I question. But anyway, Mr. Patrick, one of our panelists down in South Florida, has a question for our debaters.
Thank you,
Go ahead, Patrick. You're on the Liberty Show.
So just wanted to discuss the idea that I think Tim had said that I didn't have any kids, so I shouldn't be on the hook to pay for education. And Jed, I'm not sure quite understand what point you were trying to make in regards to education. And this may sound naive because we all know what the education system is like, but don't we all have a vested interest as a country to make sure that our younger generations are educated and they can do things like become a doctor, build a bridge, fly an airplane, build a road, all those things that are important to make sure a country can function correctly. And I know that, and again, I realize how poor the educational system is in a lot of places, but to say that you can opt out of paying for that, well, then that just puts the financial burden more so on the parents, and maybe it becomes so burdensome they opt out of having kids. Eventually, you have a
But let me ask, you brought up a good question. I mean, Patrick, what is wrong with putting the financial burden on the parents? That's kind of a point that when I grew up, my mom was a single mom. She never got $1 of welfare because she worked. And she paid for me to go to school. She paid for my books and everything and my food. We didn't get free lunch or anything. I didn't even get to ride the bus to school, and we lived miles away in the snow. But when I went to college, I didn't qualify for student loans and whatever. She paid. So, I mean, why is that such a bad thing to put the burden on people? That's kind of my pet peeve, is that we don't want people to take care of themselves. That's not what you're saying, is it?
Kevin, I'm going to guess that you're a little bit older than I am.
I owe you for that.
Yeah, well, the fact is that there was a time when a single parent could, possibly do all of that without, working their entire life and dying on a factory floor. But we don't live in that time right now. As it currently stands, without parents having to, there's a lot of people who are opting out of having children simply because they know dang well that it's way too expensive. Now, this doesn't necessarily have to be a problem, especially with all the advances we've made in automation and stuff like that. And that brings me to that would bring me to a whole different point where I don't necessarily believe that. I think that money and our form of credit and the way that the means of production are controlled are starting to reach a point where it's actually inhibiting our ability. And one of the points I was trying to make earlier when it comes to education is that we've had people defunding education, and they're not doing the reason why they're doing this is because they're doing this so that people can say, well, look at how terrible the education system is. It's not working. How about we just send all of our children to private schools that the parents have to pay for out of their own pocket? Parents are already working enough that they're starting to disconnect from their children because both parents have to work, usually full time. And this is what the current burdens that they have. If they start having more burdens, they won't be able to afford it, and you'll end up with a bunch of undereducated system. Now, in an ideal anarcho-communist society, that wouldn't necessarily be a factor because, well, for a number of different reasons, but people would get educated, but they'd be educated more, toward their strengths and toward the type of work that they're interested in doing, and they would have plenty of free time.
Stuff like history.
Yeah, and
so Patrick, were you finished with your question?
It was kind of what in line with what Jed had said, is that if it becomes too cost prohibitive, and we are kind of already getting there already, people will just opt out. And we look at a society that's moving more and more towards automation, more and more towards a highly technical country. You're going to have a wider gap between the have and the have-nots, because if you're not able to afford a high-end computer to learn these skills, you're just not going to be able to do it. You're not going to be educated in a manner that can make you productive in society. So I think there is something to be said there for a basic education being afforded towards our kids, and it's not been done great.
But let me ask you this, and I agree with what you said. I'm a very compassionate, but we have so many assumptions in here. But why can't you afford a high-end computer? If you take the money you get and you go and misuse it, you put it in your hair, you go spend it gambling or drugs, or just, then there's some people who are poor. But why are some people poor? They chose not to study or to, better themselves. And then some people do have disabilities or things that, are beyond their control. But even then, there's a way to lift up. But we're going to change the subject. We're going to continue. We don't want to get stuck on education. But we want to actually go to, this is the heated one, which we already have kind of tip the iceberg up. Then we're going to open up to we're going to let Jed and Tim ask each other questions. But what is the role of the federal government in, let's call it social welfare programs, that's taking care of people? Because we're going to start with Tim. Tim, straighten us out.
Well, it depends, right? So I'll give an example of our former illustrious president, President Obama. When Obama was president, he presided over us, reigned over us during the financial downturn. And this was an interesting time because then at this point in time, a lot of people, lots of people who had been working decades, working all of their lives, or at least most of their lives, and even those that were new to the workforce, found themselves unemployed. And they thought, hey, I have this unemployment insurance that I've been paying, whether it was being paid directly or indirectly. And we know that employment insurance is extorted from the individual indirectly. They thought that because they have this so-called employment insurance, and that's what unemployment is, it is a form of insurance, it is a type of insurance. They thought that, hey, the government has my back and I will be able to collect funds against the cash that was already indirectly extorted against me. And what did they find out? They found out that, hey, it doesn't work that way. First, you have this, the state that you live in gets to dictate to you, hey, do you get how many weeks? Do you get how many months? And on top of that, the federal government also gets to say how many weeks, how many months you get to collect your unemployment insurance. So do I believe that the federal government should have a say in unemployment? That depends on the individual. I personally prefer what Bush Jr. stated. He said, well, hey, maybe regarding a person being extorted into paying into Social Security, he said, well, maybe the individual should get to decide how they plan for their retirement. Maybe Social Security isn't the way. This is my point of view when it comes to unemployment insurance. I don't believe the federal government is the way. And the reason why I don't believe the federal government is the way is because we don't actually get to negotiate the terms of our unemployment insurance. What I say is that the individual should be able to decide how they invest and prepare should they be unemployed. It should be up to the individual to decide whether they want to be fund their own unemployment insurance or should they seek it through the federal government.
Well, what about social welfare programs like food stamps and Medicare and stuff like that?
As a libertarian, I don't have a problem against social welfare in general, as long as the individual isn't extorted into paying for it. So if I want to receive welfare or food stamps or what have you, or I want my neighbor to receive welfare or food stamps or what have you, I should be able to opt in and opt out of said programs. That's the role of the federal government to the individual from a libertarian point of view. It's voluntary. Should I not want to pay for it? Then I'm not forced to pay for it. I'm not extorted into paying for it. Should I want to pay for it? Here's my money. Do with it as you wish.
Okay, Jedidiah, the same question to you. What's the role of the federal government in social welfare programs?
Ideally, as I've stated before, there wouldn't be a need for social welfare programs. But I don't really mind that my taxes are going toward paying for social welfare programs. Honestly, I think that the wealthy also shouldn't mind that the government is taking some of their money and spending it on social welfare programs, because honestly, the way that things are going in this country without social welfare programs, people would be constructing guillotines, to be honest with you. I mean, the gap of wealth has become enough, and people are having to work 2 or 3 jobs to survive and you know, create OnlyFans accounts if you got the body for it, or you know, all these things that people do, this constant hustle. It doesn't allow for people enough time to realize just how badly they're being screwed. So I imagine. But let me
ask you, Jed, is that a bad thing that they have to hustle and work hard, or should we just sit around, they lay around and other people take care of them?
Oh, okay, hold on a second. I don't have a problem with people working. And people have to work for a society to function. But I the problem that I have is that how can I put this here? We work now because we have to. We're constantly competing for these pieces of paper, and the cost of everything has gone up so much that you have to work harder than almost than the generation before you did, just to afford things like a house or rent. I mean, the mortgage on my house is cheaper than the rent people pay. And I was lucky to be able to get that mortgage. Not everybody can. I mean, the credit system in this country is a complete freaking scam. You know, I had to go into debt so that I could get a credit score, because I had lived my life responsibly enough where I didn't have any outstanding bills. I never took out any loans. I never used a credit card. And then I start getting screwed because of the fact that I had no credit score when it came time for me to start. So I actually had to go into debt, calculated debt, and pay it off just to raise my credit score. Now, that type of thing is far more just oppressive to the population as a whole than the government taking some taxes, even though I don't necessarily like the idea of a federal government. Like I said, if we have to live in a defined border space called the United States of America, and we got to pay taxes, which we do, and both of the parties that are in control are going to continue that. It just depends on who's paying them and what. But I would rather that they use that tax money to provide some social welfare programs for people, so that we don't get to the point where people are starting to, have to resort more to, robbing people or, I mean,
I agree with you 100% to that point.
One last thing I want to say is this population is too divided right now for them to see who the true enemy is. So in this objectivist society that we've created, if the bottom fell out financially, neighbors would just be fighting neighbors. They wouldn't.
Well, that's going to happen. So get ready.
Yeah.
If I could just interject here.
Either on the left or the right is going to fall out. But my question for you, Jed, is I agree that you don't want it to get so bad that people get to robbing. But is that, whose fault is that? My thing is, you go back to education. If they're educated, if they know how to take care of themselves, if they know how to grow their own crops, that wouldn't happen. But we have people that would rather go rob and take somebody else's than to go work and make their own, or maybe even have to plant a garden. So that's a whole nother topic. Okay.
If I could just jump in on this, if I could be quick and just jump in on this, Jedidiah has given us the lay of the land and shown us what the problems are, but he has not pointed to who is the problem maker. This issue, and he's identified two issues. Jedidiah has identified two issues that I like to hit on. He's identified the wealth gap and he's identified inflation. Now, who are the reasons why we have such a wealth gap in this country? It's not the rich and it's not the poor being lazy. The problem lies with the federal government intruding and pushing their way and creating regulations and laws that hinder the individual from being the best individual that they can be. I'll give an example and I'll be very quick about this. Look at the Dodd-Frank Act. This was a piece of legislation that was created that went into effect during Obama's reign. This was bankers, literally. All of the bankers in this country got together and they said, we have a problem with individuals being able to take advantage of leverage that we gave to homeowners. So because we have a problem with this, we want legislation to be created so that we're able to keep all of the profits between ourselves. This is what the federal government does. It gets with the wealthy, it gets with the elites, the political elites, and it creates legislation that hampers the growth, that hampers the potential of the individual from being their best person. It's the same with inflation. Well, the cost of bread has gone up. So because the cost of bread has gone up, we've got to give social welfare. We've got to give food stamps to the poor. Who is the reason? Who caused inflation to grow? Who caused the and I did this. Listen, I like rib sandwiches. Went to Walmart because it was closer to me and went to get a loaf of bread to make my rib sandwich from the lady who sells ribs down the street from me. I was shocked that a loaf of bread was $4 and some odd cents for a loaf of bread. Now, should a poor person be upset that their loaf of bread is for something? Of course they should. But the problem isn't with the bread maker. The problem is with the monetary funds or monetary systems that are in place and acts that are caused by the government. One of the biggest, if not the biggest, is quantitative easing. Won't get into that. That's a topic unto itself. But here's the point. All of these problems that the individual, that poor people, that middle class people face, it's not because the world is against you. We all have one common enemy, and that common enemy is the federal government and its policies. It's screwing us over, and it's screwing us over so that the wealthy classes, so that the elites can prosper, and we get the short end of the stick.
You're so freaking close. You've admitted that the federal government gets together with the elites. I think you're not understanding the power dynamic here. The elites control the federal government. And I'm talking about all of them, like the Republicans and the Democrats. You know, the Republicans like to point their fingers at donors like Soros, and the Democrats point their fingers at people like, you know, the Mercer family. But the fact is that the government is already controlled by all of the elites. Trump was a donor. Trump was a Clinton donor at one point in time. I mean, that's the way that our government works. So if the enemy is not the federal government, the enemy is the elites, because all the elites are doing is using the federal government to do what they would do on their own in the absence of a federal government.
What you just stated is a difference without it, is a distinction without a difference. Yes, the federal government, the elites, they're all in the same pile. You hit on something earlier. You said, well, if we don't have these social welfare programs, then the guillotines will go out. Well, here's the thing, right? I don't have a problem with the guillotines, because what the guillotines do is that it creates a level playing field. We need to hold these elites accountable. And you said, well, ideally in a perfect world, and I'm paraphrasing here, it would be as you described, Tim, where, you know, we wouldn't have these intrusions and everyone would be kumbaya. The reason why we don't have the reason why we don't live in this so-called perfect society is because we're not willing to hold our overlords accountable. We have been suckered and bamboozled into buying in, into believing that the Democrats believe that the Democrats are for us, and that the Republicans, if you're a religious individual, are for you. Neither party is for you. They are for the elites. They are for the political classes. And until the individual decides that I'm no longer going to be screwed over, guess what? We will continue being screwed over. So yes, I clearly understand that the elites, that the political classes, that the wealthy classes control the federal government. They are all in the same pot, and they are all screwing us over. And they will continue to screw us over until we as individuals take to the streets.
I agree with
the streets and demand that we not, listen, here's the thing. The average individual in this country doesn't understand how prostitution works. They don't understand that if someone's going to do their business on you, or someone expects you to do their business on you, that you need to be paid for it. Until the individual, the common man, understands how prostitution works, they will continue to be screwed over and ask for more without actually being paid for their services. So yes, I understand that it is the political class, it is the elites, and they control the federal government. The federal government is the political classes, it is the elites. But until the individual, the common man, decides that they're no longer going to be screwed over, they will be screwed over. So the answer isn't that we get more social welfare. Social welfare is a pacifier. It is crack cocaine to the individual. It's what keeps us on the plantation. If you want to be free, guess what? The slaves, when they were after the so-called Emancipation Proclamation, they were still slaves, because it only freed the slaves that were in states that were against the federal government. Forget that. Even after slavery was abolished, they were still slaves. Why? Because the elites, the political classes, created black laws. No slave owner is going to let a slave just willy-nilly walk away, because that person represents capital. That person represents wealth. So until the individual American understands just how much they are worth, they will continue to be screwed over, because if you act like a donkey, people will ride you like a donkey.
Okay, and I agree with that. I agree with everything you just said. But my problem with American libertarianism is your answer to that seems to be to take out the middleman and give the elite complete control, because you still want to be governed through a society that's got money, and the elites already have the money. The
I don't think you understand how libertarianism works. Libertarianism isn't about being governed.
No,
that's not libertarianism.
Exactly. But if you do something about the being governed, and you don't do something about the fact that the elites have, with the absence of the federal government, the elites will just go to private industries to do all the shitty things. You talk about the plantation, the government pre-emancipation, and not even pre-emancipation, because if you look at the 13th Amendment, slavery is still legal as punishment for a crime.
Yes.
You know, but those plantations and the boats that carried the slaves over, that was all private industry doing what private industry wanted to do, and the government allowed them to do it. And since they bought the government, even back then, the government made it easier for them to do it. But before the government made it easier for them to do it, they still did it, and they would continue doing it if there wasn't people saying, no, you can't do that. There's still a slave trade, and prostitution is a private business. All of the terrible things that happen in the world, the drug cartels are a private business. All of the terrible things that are being done by the government are being done at the behest of the private sector. And
okay, guys, we're going to call it there because we're starting to wrap. Those are some really great points. We're going to bring in Kevin Wilson from up in New York and see what he wants to add to this conversation. So Kevin, you're back on the Liberty Show. Do you have a question or comment?
I do. Yeah, thanks for having me on again. My question to both panelists is, do you think that people are inherently good or evil? And then how does that view impact your role of the state or a lack of state in your ideal vision for society?
I believe, this is Jedidiah here, I believe that people are born inherently blank slates. They're neither, they don't, good and evil in reality are objective terms. To what's good to one person could be evil to another person, obviously. But if you want to get with, start with the basics, people are what society conditions them to be. If you live in a society where from day one you're expected to struggle to survive, then you're going to do whatever you have to do to struggle to survive by the rules of the game, and by breaking the rules of the game, if the game becomes, gets to the point that you have to break the rules and deal with those consequences, those people will, if you're raised like that, if that's your life, then you're going to be what you're going to be. But if you're raised in a society that values other things, if you're raised in a society where, you're that's not the goal in life, that's not your reason for being born, is just to struggle until you die, then it might be different. I mean, I don't necessarily, I believe people adapt to their surroundings, and whether those adaptations are perceived as good or whether they're perceived as evil depends on the individual. Now, I personally don't think that prostitution is evil. I don't think that in a society where we're struggling and competing against each other for pieces of money so that we can pay for every aspect of our lives, I don't think somebody using their body consensually to make money is a bad thing if that's their choice. I don't think that's bad. I don't like a society where somebody has to do that. But in a society where people have to do that, I think that that's fine. I have a problem with it personally when it goes too far, and when people are coerced into it, and when sex trafficking, people being trafficked without their consent, and sex slavery, which is something that still exists in the world. That sort of thing I have a problem with. So like I said, good and evil are kind of subjective. Are objective. I don't think that being gay is evil. But if you ask a evangelical Christian, well, they'll tell you differently.
Tim, go ahead.
Yeah, so I don't care, and I don't believe most people care whether you're good or bad. I believe most individuals are selfish. So because most individuals are selfish, we need to appeal to their selfishness. Now, this common thread has shown itself that we need to pay for education because what about the children? What's going to happen to the children when they grow up? Where are the doctors going to come from if we don't educate the children? You see, now that's a very selfish argument to me, because what you're telling me is, hey, Tim, you should stop being selfish because when you get old, you're going to need a doctor. Tim, you should stop being selfish because you like driving on the roads. And without these kids that we have now in school, without giving them a decent education, they're not going to read manuals on how to operate bulldozers to create and maintain the roads. So you see, this is a selfish argument and it appeals to me because I see how it benefits me. So do I believe people are inherently good or bad? I don't really care. What I do know and what I do understand is that the individual is inherently selfish. So we need to speak to their selfishness, show the individual how being altruistic benefits them. Hey, when you just give money to the homeless, you are doing a good thing, but not only are you doing a good thing, more importantly to you, Tim, a selfish individual, you will feel better about yourself. That appeals to me. So that's my answer. I don't care. And I don't know whether people are inherently good. Doesn't bother me. It's not something I consider at night. What I do consider is how do I appeal to their selfishness?
Okay, so Jed and Tim, you're going to ask each other questions. We're going to start with Jed. Jed, ask Tim your first question.
Okay, I want to go back to something that we talked about on a different show. We were talking about a company poisoning a river that is a town's drinking water, and you were talking about how if you lived in that town, in your ideal society, you would sue them. And I was trying to ask you.
No, I never said sue. You said sue. What I said was I would arbitrate. Arbitrate,
okay. My question is, I need you to explain how arbitration would work in a society where the elites still control the means of production, but there's no federal government.
Okay, so that is a deep question, and it is an excellent question because it is something that libertarians are asked commonly. So here's the reason why I want to specify that I'm not in favor of suing, I'm in favor of arbitrating. The problem with suing, and this was something that you alluded to during that show, is that when you sue, guess what? You are now reverting to the government. You are now reverting to your oppressors. And I totally and fully agree with that. To sue the person or the entity that would pollute my waters, let's say I own a lake and they were dumping, Army Corps of Engineers or whomever was dumping waste into my lake. Well, to sue them would be absurd because the judges are literally paid in part by not only my tax dollars, like that's part of it, but most, at least, well, here in Georgia, judges can receive 50% of their income from the fees that they levy. And those fees are court fees, going to prison, going to jail. Yes, you literally pay the judge to send you to jail. You literally pay the judge to send you to prison. So no, I am not in favor of paying my oppressors and believing and hoping that my oppressors are actually going to give me justice. What I'm in favor of is when someone dumps their waste into my water, they pollute my waterways, that I should be able to arbitrate. Well, what do you mean by arbitrate? I mean that in a libertarian society, now you said in my, where I live, I'm paraphrasing. So let's say that I live, well, I actually do. I live in Castleberry Hill. It's a neighborhood in Atlanta. It's in downtown Atlanta. In a libertarian society, all of the individuals that live in Castleberry Hill would be owners. So because we're all owners, we would not allow an individual to come into our neighborhood unless they have permission. And part of that permission is an understanding that should you spill your waste in our community, that we have the ability to arbitrate against you. And how would we do that? Who would be the arbitrator? Well, that would be something that we would negotiate with those that could dump waste into our neighborhoods. Well, that sounds far-fetched. Well, no, every day folks use this system. Anyone who is familiar with cryptocurrencies understands what a smart contract is. A smart contract states that should you screw me over, we're not going to involve the authorities because we have a third-party arbitrator who holds all of the keys, literally, and they're going to make the right the wrong right. So that's how, in a libertarian society, we would be able to address an individual or an entity dumping waste on my property, in my waterway, on my lake, whatever. That's how we would address it. All of the people in my community, we would all be owners, and no one could enter into our community.
I get that. Okay, I understand that, but who enforces it?
When you
say there's a factory dumping waste into your waterways, and you as a community of owners say, hey, I don't like you doing this, breaching some contract or whatever ends up happening. What's to stop the factory worker from, I don't know, hiring security and continuing to run their factory anyway?
Guns, big, juicy, fat, black guns. All of the individuals in my community would be owners of all of the machine guns that they could purchase. This would keep us from having an individual or entity coming into our neighborhood and screwing us over. Guns, machine guns, missiles.
Unless the private entity who already can afford to buy a factory can also afford to hire mercenaries, which
that's an excellent point. So you see, here's the thing, right? This is the part about being selfish. So now it would be up to my community to go next door to the West End and Westview and convince those individuals that they need to bring their big, black, heavy guns and missiles to my neighborhood to protect ourselves from these interlopers that would not only destroy my waterways, but their waterways. This is the point of libertarianism, is that we're not trying to appeal to the goodness of the individual. We're trying to appeal to the selfishness of the individual.
Okay, let's go. Tim, you have a question for Jed?
Yes, Jed, I understand that you are a member of a gun club. Do you like big black guns, or are you a stainless steel kind of guy?
I'm an AK-47 SKS type of person. I own a Glock, and funny enough, it's a Detroit Police Department issue Glock that I bought from a jewelry store. I thought that whole situation was kind of ironic in itself. But
point with this, Tim, that why you're asking him?
Yes, most socialists, or at least from TV, from watching CNN, we're led to believe that most socialists are anti-gun. If we listen to AOC, who's a Democratic Socialist, and if we listen to Uncle Bernie has changed his tune. He used to be pro-gun, or at least more pro-gun than he currently is. We're led to believe that socialists are anti-gunners, that they are totally against the individual arming themselves. I don't know who all were able to catch Larry Sharp this week, but he had a show, and shout out to Larry Sharp, a huge fan of his radio show, and we have Kevin Wilson, of course, on. Larry talked about his meeting with socialists, and he made an observation that was very interesting. He stated that most socialists are very pro-Second Amendment. And the reason why they're, at least the socialists that he's come in contact with, are very pro-Second Amendment. And the reason why they're very pro-Second Amendment is because they realize that even though they have great ideas, their great ideas aren't enough to win people over. It's going to take guns. So that's why I was asking if Jedidiah was pro-Second Amendment, because I'm trying to get a feel for his commitment to socialism. And my follow-up question was going to be, or it currently still is, Jedidiah, do you have a problem with socialists using force to bring forth a full-on socialist country?
Capitalists already use force to maintain a capitalist country.
That would be crony capitalism.
That's a funny little distinction.
No, it's a huge distinction.
It's a real,
but it is huge. It is a huge distinction.
It doesn't get away from the fact that, going back to what I said earlier, when it comes to the super wealthy, the only thing the government is there to do is to allow them to do what they would do if the government didn't exist, as much as they can possibly get away with doing. So the fact that it's crony capitalism doesn't comfort me with the idea of the absence of a federal government. It just reminds me that the people who actually control the federal government would do a lot worse if there weren't pesky things like regulations and laws to stop them from doing it.
Here's the problem with that argument, Jedidiah, right? Is that you have stated that it is the ruling classes that create these regulations via the federal government. But then on the other hand, you say, hey, it's these pesky regulations that keep the ruling classes in check. You can't have it both ways.
Yeah,
and I will let me just finish this point. But no, it doesn't. Here's an example, a great example. The greatest example of this is the housing downturn. It's the fall of the stock markets, and not only the stock markets, but markets in general collapse. That was the elitists, the political elites. It was the wealthy classes creating regulations from the federal government that was quote unquote going to police them. We can't expect the foxes to mind the hen house, and this is the problem with saying, well, let me finish that. That's the problem and the flaw with saying that, hey, we have these elitists who use the government to screw over the individual, but at the same time, we have these regulations that keep them in check. You can't have it both ways.
Yeah, except for I'm not talking about those kind of regulations. I'm talking about the pesky regulations such as human beings aren't capital. Because there's a whole lot of people.
Of course, human beings are capital. Human beings are the definition of what capital is. Capital is simply a resource that's used to create and gain wealth. That's it. So if you work for your employer, guess what? You are capital towards your employer.
And you would be a slave to your employer if the government didn't tell you you couldn't. The plantations would still exist with the slaves. If
plantations do exist, they're called work farms. Plantations still exist. They're called Quincy and Gretna and Gadsden County. We have plantations today.
Exactly.
But here's the problem. The reason why we have plantations today is not because of again, you can't have it both ways. You can't say that the federal government keeps plantations from happening when we still have plantations. This is the flaw with your logic and your talking points, is that you're hoping that the federal government is going to reverse itself. It never reverses itself. It just grows larger. So we will always have plantations until
give a rebuttal.
Okay, hold on. We have plantations because the capitalists want there to be plantations. If there wasn't a federal government, there would be more plantations because that's a good business choice. Slavery is a good business choice. It's not morally right. If you're living in a purely capitalist society, then that's great. Good for you. You're winning the game. The federal government just allows the horrible people to do what they would do through the absence of the federal government. Now, I don't like the federal government. I think you're coming off here as if I actually like the federal government or trust the federal government. I don't, but I realize that your way of thinking puts the people who already have all of the resources in complete control and just gets rid of the middleman. That's my problem with it.
Jedidiah, you've already stated that they already are in control because they are the puppet masters to the federal government. You can't have it both ways.
You seem to want to accept that they're in control and let them have complete control.
No, Jedidiah, that's not true. What I said was we need to bring back the guillotines because the guillotines create a more level playing ground.
And then what replaces? What happens after the guillotines is what
I'll tell you what happens when we hold those people who are accountable for screwing us over. Now after we've held them accountable, now we have the power and the authority, we have the autonomy to live our best life without intrusion from those people who would enslave us. That's what happens.
And then we have the authority to go ahead and just make the same damn mistakes that we made before if we don't.
Again, that would, from my point of view, that would be impossible because then communities like my neighborhood, we would come together and we would say, we're going to stand up to a system that we had before. And that's such a great idea. We would be able to go to the community next door to us, the Weston, and we convince them of the same thing. And this would spread like wildfire. It would be the gospel of capitalism. And everyone would say, yes, the gospel of capitalism is the way. And there goes your libertarian society off and running.
I don't think that's what would happen at all. I think that if capitalism still is allowed to exist and the wealthy are still allowed to own the means of production, they're just going to go ahead and redo everything they did and get more rich, because that's how you win the game. When you're competing for pieces of money, that's how you win the game, is to get all of the money and get rid of all of your competition and keep your labor force, your labor costs as low as you can. And if labor costs give you a problem in one area, you just pack up your factory and move.
Jedidiah, I have a quick question for you. With what I just outlined, my community coming together and saying we're going to live under this banner of capitalism, and we going and convincing all of the other communities to live under this banner of capitalism, how do we become enslaved?
When one person gets really good at it in your community and ends up acquiring all of the means of production, because that's how you win.
How does that happen, Jedidiah? We all have agreed to this. How does that happen?
You've agreed to what? To continue?
To capitalism, to true capitalism. How do we find ourselves enslaved again?
How do you not?
Don't answer the question with the question. Explain to me, how do we find ourselves enslaved again?
We're going to call time. You guys get a 3-minute final statement. Well, first of all, were there any other questions?
I'm going to use my 3 minutes to allow Jedidiah to explain how we fall under enslavement again.
Hold on a sec. Let's see whether it was Patrick, Miss Charlie, Kev, anybody else have a question for
a real small brain question for Jed is, in this purely capitalistic society that you've outlined here, where it's going to be nothing but work farms and things like that, why doesn't some other capitalist come along and decide to pay someone $1 for doing work, and then someone comes along and then pays $2 for the work? Why? This is like very basic economy right there. Is if someone is a slave working for free, someone comes along and offers them $1, they're going to take that job instead. So I don't know where you kind of got this
exactly
all or nothing view of.
Thank you.
Hold on a second. What's to stop the person who is paying the slave nothing from wiping out the person who wants to pay the slave $1?
Well, if this is going to be warlords and beyond Thunderdome, sure, okay, you could have an environment like that where it's nothing but thugs and warlords that are running things, but that's not real life. That is
real life. That's real life in parts of the world right now, and it's real, and it's been real life in periods of our history that aren't that far from now. It has been real life.
Jedidiah, in those places in the world, the common man does not own missiles. He does not own guns.
That's not true.
We're going back.
Okay, where point to tell me where are these places, Jedidiah, where the common man owns a gun and he's able to still find himself enslaved?
Most of Africa.
Okay, point to one country in Africa where this is existing. Thank you. What's the question, Kevin?
You have 3 minutes for a finale comment, and then Jed has 3 minutes.
I just want you to expound upon Jedidiah's fear of capitalism. It is an unfounded fear. Nowhere in the world does a common man own a gun, have the ability to defend himself, and still find himself enslaved. That doesn't mean that common man doesn't find himself fighting against those that would enslave him. I would rather die on my feet fighting my enslaver than live a life of somewhat comfort being enslaved. And this is what the definition, and this is what those of us who believe in liberty understand. We understand that it would be better for us to die fighting for our freedoms. It would be better for us to die and bleed fighting for our freedoms, our liberties, for our kids' kids, than for us to live this peaceful life where we're nothing more than someone's capital, then we're nothing more than someone's chattel. If you as the individual believes it's okay to lead a comfortable life as a slave, guess what? That's your prerogative. And I respect your prerogative to be a slave. Whereas I say, and my friends and I say, we don't want to be slaves. We don't want to be comforted by social welfare. We don't want to be comforted by our overlords. What we want is to be able to lead our lives as we see fit. And that is what liberty is.
Okay, right. Jed, final comment, 3 minutes.
My rebuttal to that is going to be that history is filled with people who were willing to fight to the death rather than be slaves. And history is also filled with people who failed to fight to the death and ended up slaves. People didn't decide to be slaves. They weren't born one day, hey, I'm going to be a slave. No, they were forced into slavery, and not always by a government. The continent of Africa was a bunch of different sovereign groups of people who would sometimes fight amongst each other, but then a larger force came in and enslaved them and colonized them and started taking, and that force is still there, controlling their governments, and in some cases outright controlling the land and controlling the economy from European countries and from the United States. These companies are just taking these people's resources. They have access to guns, but most of them can't afford them.
Yeah, I think what's in Africa right now is actually the Chinese Communist Party, which is that's what
except I personally don't think that the Chinese are all that communists anymore. They have strayed a long way from the ideals of Chairman Mao, and the proof of that is the fact that they're like the second largest economy in the world. Like the United States is afraid of being overtaken by China's economy. I mean, that doesn't sound very communist, especially since, according to most libertarianism, what most people who misunderstand the definition of communism go by, it always fails.
Well, because we've got a capitalist society here, we have to pay our workers. Over there, they've got slave labor camps to make the products that they sell over here. So
they have slave labor camps in non-communist countries too. You can't.
I'm talking about this country. You keep wanting to point to other countries, but we're concerned about this country right here. We don't have slave labor camps here. They do in other countries.
Yes, we do. It's called prison, and they're private prisons. They're not.
Prisons they're making the iPads and all that. Our prisons are
in this country. You're talking about this country.
No, I don't.
There are slave labor camps, and they're called prison.
What are they making?
Okay, guys, I have to call time.
Look it up, man.
Damon?
You gotta look. No, I just got to tell the guy. You gotta look up what the prisons actually make. It's interesting. All the companies that got their finger in this. It's really something you should research.
Thank you guys for listening to us on the Liberty Show this week. And we want to have a special shout out to one of our founders of our show, David McKay. He's really going through some health issues in the hospital. We pray for him and his family. Guys, you can follow us on Facebook, like us, and also on Instagram. You can subscribe with us on YouTube. Thanks so much and have a great day.